It began like any other siege, grim, steady, mechanical. Osowiec Fortress, tucked into the northeastern corner of what is now Poland, stood like a broken tooth in the muddy jaws of the Eastern Front. For months it had resisted German advances, its Russian defenders enduring constant shelling, hunger, and the kind of gnawing fear that only trench warfare can breed. But in early August of 1915, the silence between bombardments changed. It thickened. The air itself began to taste wrong. Then came the green cloud, a slow-moving, rolling fog, heavy and unnatural. Trees wilted in its path, birds dropped from the sky, and the men, those still standing, clawed at their throats as the gas reached them. Chlorine, weaponized by the German 11th Army, swept across the battlefield like a biblical plague. The German commanders had planned this for weeks. They had grown tired of Oswiec's resilience. Its stubborn garrison was a thorn in the German advance, and the fortress, though old, had proven maddeningly resistant. So they turned to something new, something monstrous. At 4 a.m. on August 6th, over 30 batteries opened up, pounding the fortress with explosives. Then came the gas. Thousands of Russian troops were caught off guard. Chlorine laced the air, turning to hydrochloric acid in their lungs. Men vomited blood, stumbled blindly, collapsed. Skin blistered, eyes swelled shut. The smell of death wasn't metaphorical, it was everywhere. And yet somehow it wasn't over. Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinski could barely breathe. The 21-year-old officer staggered through the chaos, coughing and choking, his uniform soaked in sweat and blood. Around him, a few dozen men remained, barely alive. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were nightmares made flesh. The chlorine had devoured their lungs. Many had wrapped their faces in rags, soaked in urine, as a desperate buffer against the gas. Now those cloths were red, soaked through with blood. Flesh hung in shreds from raw bone. Some were missing parts of their faces, noses gone, lips burned away, eyes weeping pus. These were the men the Germans would come to fear. The Germans had assumed the fortress was neutralized. Recon units advanced with caution at first, but with no fire returning, they relaxed. Engineers with flamethrowers and sappers moved in to claim the ruins. Behind them marched 2 full battalions, ready to sweep up the last survivors and finally, definitively, crush Osowiec. What they encountered instead was unholy. From the fog came movement, slow, staggering. Figures rising from the craters and trenches, shambling forward, weapons in hand, moaning but not from fear. They were coughing blood. Their flesh was falling off their faces. And they were charging. There were 60 of them, 60 Russian soldiers, barely able to stand, let alone fight, suddenly surged from the battered remnants of the fortress, with bayonets fixed and rifles ready. They screamed, choked, gurgling howls, and hurled themselves at the enemy with a fury that defied reason. The Germans panicked. Imagine it, trained troops armed with flamethrowers and gas masks, watching in horror as blood-soaked, half-dead figures shambled through poison mist, stabbing, shooting, slashing. They looked like dead men, one German officer later wrote, wrapped in blood and rags, walking out of the grave. The retreat turned into a rout. German lines broke. Soldiers dropped weapons and ran, trampling each other. Horses reared and bolted. Flamethrowers were abandoned, munitions left behind. Dozens were killed not by Russian bullets, but by the sheer terror that seized them. It wasn't just the violence, it was what they saw, a vision straight from hell. The Russians gave no quarter. They fought like men who had already died and had nothing left to lose. And maybe in some way, they had. For days after the counterattack, the fortress held. German forces hesitated to advance again. The memory of the dead men haunted them. Reports of the countercharge spread quickly, not just among German units, but across both sides of the front. Soldiers whispered of demons, of the undead, of vengeance from beyond the grave. Kotlinski, the young lieutenant who led the charge, would not live to see the full impact of what he had done. He died later that day from his wounds. Others followed in the days to come, yet their legend had already taken root. Osowiec eventually fell, not to battle, but to strategy. As German troops advanced elsewhere and Russian forces began a larger retreat across the front, the High Command ordered the fortress abandoned. The defenders destroyed what they could and pulled back, leaving behind a scorched husk. But the story remained. What happened at Osowiec on August 6, 1915, was not just a battle. It was a message carved in blood and acid and sheer, unimaginable will. We will not go quietly. The attack of the dead men was more than a moment of horror. It was the world's rude awakening to the reality of chemical warfare. Until then, poison gas had been used sporadically. The Germans deployed chlorine at Ypres earlier in 1915, shocking the Allies but not turning the tide. But Osowiec revealed something new. Gas wasn't just a weapon, it was psychological terror. It broke men before a shot was fired. Yet even gas had limits. The Russians, unprepared and unequipped, showed that the human body, in extremis, could push beyond those limits. They showed that terror could swing both ways. In trying to break their enemy's spirit, the Germans had unwittingly made monsters, icons of wrath and resilience. And the world watched. Skeptics might say the story was embellished, that the Russian soldiers weren't really dead men, just wounded, that the Germans fled from surprise, not ghosts. But multiple sources on both sides corroborated the event. Even German officers acknowledged the panic. Russian accounts are vivid, consistent, and tragically personal. Regardless of the finer details, what remains undeniable is this. The event struck deep. It has inspired books, films, video games, and countless retellings. Osowiec became a symbol not of death, but of refusal. The refusal to die, to surrender, to let horror win. And maybe that's why the story still matters. Because it isn't just about gas or tactics or war, it's about human defiance. You might think this is where the story ends. With the fortress abandoned, the attackers dead, the legend secured. But here's the thing about legends. They echo. In the decades that followed, as warfare grew more brutal and chemical weapons evolved, Osowiec kept coming up in whispers. In 1939, when Nazi forces again marched east, they found Osowiec empty, but eerily preserved. Locals swore the place was haunted. In 1941, during Operation Barbarossa, German troops once more approached the ruins. Some officers refused to bivouac inside. They had heard the stories, and in one account, rarely published and hard to verify, a German patrol exploring the fortress claimed to find bones, dozens of them in formation. As if the defenders had simply lain down, still in ranks, and died where they stood. They called them the guardians of the gate, and perhaps, just perhaps, they still wait. Because the dead men at Osowiec weren't just soldiers, they were a warning. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the truth hiding in the shadows.